We are live coming at you Saturday night, November 26th. Got a lot to talk about today. Obviously, Michigan handling Ohio State earlier today. A&M coming out of nowhere to beat LSU. Alabama handling business in the Iron Bowl, although they had some ugly defense going on. We're going to talk about all of it. But Josh, let's get started. The reason why a lot of our Michigan friends are here tonight, they're here to see us eat some crow. We both absolutely whiffed on this. If you want to talk about our prediction, I think we both predicted Ohio State by double digits. The spread was around 9.5. Ohio State was favored. There's a lot that we missed in this game, frankly, and I want to talk about it. But before I talk about it, I want to set this up with there's some things that Michigan fans are going to say that they're going to be a little frustrated in this because we're also going to talk about things that Ohio State did wrong, right? That's part of it. Obviously, just to get it out of the way, like we whiffed on the pick, completely whiffed on the pick. And Michigan deserves a credit for that. But I want to start with just kind of general thoughts. What did you see? Where do you think we missed it the most? And we'll go from there.
There's a lot to unpack. I think the biggest thing we missed, obviously, was the way that Ohio State was going to give up big plays, not just in the run game, but especially the pass game. And yeah, they got their those big explosive runs that we said weren't necessarily consistent or reliable. I don't feel so bad about that because those runs came really late when the game had already kind of shifted away from Ohio State. I think the thing we missed was Michigan's ability to hit big plays down the field. And I didn't feel like Michigan threw the ball particularly well in a lot of ways, but they threw it effectively. And what I mean by that is they weren't like dropping dimes in tight windows. What they were doing is using a complementary play action game and throwing to what were repeatedly wide open guys. And I'll be blunt. I mean, part of it was the ability of the Michigan receiver. Several times they put good moves on DBs, got open. I also came away from that game, though, thinking that Ohio State safeties were just woefully deficient. I mean, they got burned over the top a bunch, but even in the long runs, like there's a long run where Edwards got around the right corner, went down the field. The safety had an angle on him, or I thought had an angle on him, and Edwards just turned the corner on the guy and ran by him. And we talked in our preview, like we do a lot of times in these big games, especially with the schedules being the way they were. Sometimes you don't always really know what a team is going to deal with when they play a game like that. You don't know where the break points are. I honestly came away from it in part thinking that, we knew Ohio State secondary had some issues, like the Maryland game, they got thrown on some. But I think there were some real deficiencies in that secondary that have been covered up all year, frankly. And when they were forced into isolation coverage, suddenly looked extremely mortal. And it was like a different ball game. At least that was my initial take. I know there's a lot more to unpack, but so I'll let you talk for a minute. But that was sort of my one initial thing was Ohio State's really their capability in the back end of staying sound in coverage because they were playing super aggressive. And if you play super aggressive, that's great, but it means you're isolated on the back end. And if you aren't busting assignments on the back end, you're going to have guys wide open for easy touchdowns. And then that was compounded late because they had a number of late scores where the safeties just did a horrible job of setting the edge coming from the back or filling gaps. And it kind of, in my opinion, kind of busted the game open.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of a point here that is a credit to Michigan in that they won in a way that we didn't see them winning. And they won in a way, frankly, they haven't won all year. We didn't see them winning because it was different from last year, right? Yes, they got the yards. Edwards ended up having a ton of rushing yards, a lot of it on that one run late, like you talked about. But if you look at, especially in the first half of this game, last year, Michigan dominated the line of scrimmage. They didn't necessarily dominate the line of scrimmage in this game. And they still won as if they did. If you looked at Stroud, and this is where I've got some issues with this offense, this Ohio State offense. If you looked at Stroud today, in the first half especially, he had all day to throw. And that wasn't the case last year. He was running a little bit for his life last year, and that Michigan defensive line got after it. This year, he had all day to throw, and not necessarily because they were just dropping 8 every time. And he didn't execute. And I will say this, you and I talked about this in a sideline conversation. it feels like Ryan Day's offensive scheme needs Stroud to be the superhero that he's shown himself to be time and time again. He has to be that guy every single play. Like, he has to make the perfect throw every single play. And they don't scheme a lot open. They don't do a lot. They don't have a lot of easy yards that are on like 3rd and 5, like a Sarkisian offense might have, by the way. Another thing I noticed, and this is a credit to Michigan's offensive line, I think, in a lot of ways, is Ohio State's pass rush was not impressive today. And as much as I think their secondary deserves a lot of heat and Michigan's scheme deserves a lot of love for freeing those guys open to make those pretty easy throws, man, I did not feel the pressure from Ohio State's pass rush that I think we've seen at other times this year. But Josh, I want to talk a little bit about how much of this is because of conference isolation. How much of this is because, we talked all year about how Michigan can be an elite team with a crappy schedule. They could be a bad team with a crappy schedule who's just won a lot of games against worse teams. Turns out it's feeling like Michigan's, an elite team at worst, 2nd seed in the playoffs. But it also turns out that maybe Ohio State is a team that hid behind a poor schedule.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody was sort of saying the same thing about Michigan and what they were, but the truth is, I'm not sure the Michigan Ohio State schedules were really all that different. I think there were things that backed it up. I'm watching right now, as a lot of people are in the corner of my eye, how USC played Notre Dame. Notre Dame certainly doesn't look like a world beater, and we knew that when they lost to Marshall. But a lot of people, especially Notre Dame fans, were turning around and saying, "Oh, yeah, we're great. Look what we did to Clemson." I mean, South Carolina just beat Clemson. I just think, I think the schedules weren't great, but I think as much as there were some good defenses in the Big Ten, what they really weren't were a lot of good offenses, and it hit a lot of stuff on the offensive side of the ball. But even defensively, where teams were good, I think they were good in certain ways. And we've seen this a lot in the Big Ten, frankly, where they play a lot of zone coverage with some of these better teams like Iowa. They tend to be, really sound, really physical. I don't know that they're super athletic. It's a constant complaint of ours, of Wisconsin in particular, that they kind of get viewed as this huge test. And while it's kind of true, when they face a really high-level offense pretty consistently, you can out-athlete them pretty bad. And in high-level quarterback play against, especially teams that are really heavy zone works well when you're playing a kind of a low-level quarterback, because there's guys coming in and out of windows, and you got to read and react, and nothing's, there's never going to be an obvious open guy most of the time, and you've got to understand how to place the ball in certain windows. Man coverage, you can do some things with crossers and whatnot and kind of get guys open. But when you're in that world, I think sometimes there's a lot of things that, you just can't properly evaluate. And I think in Ohio State's case, we had seen them, there are 5 times this season where they've just gone to sleep for a half, and something we got to talk about in a minute. They went to sleep for the second half in this game, right? People got onto us to the technicality after the Penn State game where I said, Penn State was, I think, leading in the half of Michigan. I remember right. This is the reference I made. And people's like, no, that's not true. No, they were leading 90 seconds after the half, which, actually means that I knew what happened in the game rather than just looking at the box score of the halftime score. But, that's beside the point. Here, Ohio State was winning in the half and could not maintain it. And so there are a lot of things going on, a lot of stuff we've missed, combined with problems Ohio State had over the course of the season. And I think it really all meshed into this result. And I'll say the result, people don't get mad. The result is not as bad as the score, right? This game got really out of hand late when Ohio State was trying to climb back. And then you start basically playing every play like it's 4th down and 1. And when you start being that aggressive to get an immediate stop, if the running back gets past the line of scrimmage, he's going to score. That doesn't necessarily mean they were getting beat that bad late, but it certainly ran away from them in the second half. There's a lot of super chats we probably should touch on too on this.
Yeah, and we will. I got a couple of notes just from, a couple of things. One, somebody said Michigan has blown out everybody all year. Y'all just haven't paid attention. Michigan needed a game-winning field goal at the buzzer last week to beat Illinois. And that's the issue that I kind of want to address, because people people want us to eat crow for getting it wrong, and I'm totally okay with that. We own our losses. But the thing is, I'm not going to apologize for my pick because there was no data leading into that game that suggested, like, yes, you can be a fan if you're a Michigan fan or whatever and pick your team to win every single week. And you're right until you're not. Like last year, we were crushed by these Michigan fans calling us idiots because we picked Georgia by double digits. And they said, you missed the Ohio State pick, and now you're going to come back and do this. They didn't come back and apologize because they get the luxury of missing their, picking their team every week. We have to pick teams that aren't our team, right? And the data, just like Vegas had a 9-point spread, the data didn't say that JJ McCarthy was going to come in and have his best game of his career, not against Maryland, not against Illinois, but against Ohio State on the road. And so that's where we didn't know what the running game situation. We didn't know that Edwards is going to be back healthy or able to play. So that's where the things get a little bit muddy. But I'll also say, to flip this around into a positive that I think Michigan truly earned today and have earned throughout the course of the season. Somebody in the chat said Michigan's going to get worked. I don't know what the actual word was, but Michigan's going to get worked in the playoffs. This year, Josh, it feels a little different to me because, one, I think that Michigan's probably learned some stuff from last year to make themselves better, especially offensively. I won't go on a Gaddis rant, but I think schematically they're better offensively. But two, I don't think Michigan has dropped down or gotten worse with the players they lost in a way that the rest of college football has gotten worse around them. Meaning, even if they're not better than last year, they don't necessarily have to be, because I think Georgia's worse. I think USC or TCU are worse teams than Alabama or Cincinnati were last year. Maybe not Cincinnati. So I think that, in my mind, saying that Michigan is a foregone conclusion to get their butts kicked in the playoffs is silly, because that means you're not paying attention to, one, what Michigan did today, and two, what's happened to college football this year in terms of parity.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The problem with a lot of teams is everyone seems kind of mediocre. If you looked at half at Georgia Tech, they did not look like a national title team. They were struggling with a very, very bad Georgia Tech team for quite a while, genuinely struggling before they pulled away with a run game. Georgia and Michigan actually look a lot alike, and how they play defensively, they look a little bit alike. They've gotten strained at times in the back end. They're really dependent on the run. They're not as explosive as Michigan. They're more consistent than Michigan. They run more through the tight ends, but they haven't been super consistent. USC is a great offense and a pretty porous defense. I think even in this Notre Dame game, Notre Dame didn't score a lot of points, but they still, through the air, threw it well. It was pretty obvious that Notre Dame just had no confidence in the passing game, and they lost because they're one-dimensional. But you're right. It doesn't feel like there are great, well-rounded teams. It feels like last year's Alabama team would probably be the best team this year outside of Michigan. I don't know how Michigan would compare. But yeah, it's wide open. I don't think you have to be as good as you were last year. Not every year has the same quality teams going in. We've talked a lot how year to year, not only making the playoff, but also winning the playoff differs. In 2018, that Alabama team was a juggernaut. It's just Clemson was phenomenal. And that team, I think that Alabama team had gone into the game winning every game by like 3 scores, and then Clemson just destroyed them in the national title, right? You never know who you're going to run in, and I don't see a 2018 Clemson buzzsaw. Usually there is one. Usually there's a 2019 LSU. This is the rare year where I don't think it exists. So I do think Michigan has a great opportunity. And I'll run through some super chats now real quick. David Bonnard says, checking in from the bar in Ann Arbor, go Blue Boys. Going back to celebrating now, go Blue. I mean, you got to be excited where you're at, because I think they've got everything in front of them. I think they may have had it anyway, even if they'd lost close. But at this point, they've got everything in front of them. Javari Williams says, look like y'all ain't getting that $100 super chat out of me. Go Blue. And again, we picked this game wrong. I think to some degree we picked it wrong for some right reasons, but there were a lot of things certainly we missed. Obviously, the result is the result. What happens on the field, that's the great thing about it. We can talk about it all we want. You guys can talk about it all you want. But the game gets played, and after it gets played, you gotta eat crow or see reality if you were under delusional. Benjamin V made a good point, really 2 good points, and I'll cover them first. First, he said, "Don't apologize. I picked Ohio State big pregame. You were just being realistic." But then he made the other point, which is something we touched on a second ago. How did Michigan win? And this was his second super chat, which I really appreciate. I'm a huge fan. I go to every game, home and road, but I felt like Michigan was doomed at the half. I can't believe it. I'm not an expert, but it seemed like Day really dropped the ball in the second half. Great win. And that's, to me, that's a little bit of the thing, right? And that's the difficulty in evaluating these games, because we all love to say anything can happen, right? That's, you guys know we're not huge playoff expansionists, and I'll say all this crazy chaos today, all the crazy weirdness, and these games like LSU going down and Clemson losing, not a lot of those games would have meant squat in a 12-team playoff. LSU still gets in. They're probably going to be top 12. So a lot of those games don't matter, and they do matter because we're talking about jockeying for the top 4. That would actually go away in expansion, or will go away, but that's a little bit beside the point. The bigger point here is if you are a believer that anything can happen in a given game, then it gets a little tougher to say how bad the pick was or wasn't in that Michigan game, right? Do you think this is a result that's going to happen every time? Do you think this is a game that got away from them? I mean, Ohio State had a bunch of busts in the secondary or guys wide open. Was that something that's going to happen consistently? Was it something that just happened in this game where they played poorly and got in their own heads? I don't think it was a fluke personally, but it's a question you have to ask. And I'm kind of curious your end, Daniel. I mean, if you were to assign a percentage like 0 to 100, how much of the percentage of Michigan winning this game was due to Ohio State playing below their standards? I mean, standards for this year. And how much of it is just how much better Michigan was than Ohio State as an average team over the course of the year?
I think that, we like to give a lot of credit when teams struggle, when they lose a key player in the middle of the game. So Corum going down last week with Edwards already hurt, I think completely threw that game sideways in a way that's, if you talk about what we really missed, I think that's what we missed, because we put a lot of weight in that tight score against what we think is not a great Illinois team. But I think this is an opportunity for a segue, because it's not 50-50. It's more leaning towards Michigan, and they earned it. And I do think that what we saw today is the thing that I've complained about with conference isolation. I think Ohio State was hiding behind a bad schedule. I think Michigan was playing a bad schedule, but is that dominant team. I want to talk a little bit about Ryan Day and if it's fair to say that he might be on the hot seat. And I know that sounds ridiculous because he's, 11-1 and is going to play in the Rose Bowl and probably win it again. But a couple of things here. One, the standard at Ohio State, given the talent level, it's the same thing with Alabama right now. The standard at Ohio State, given the talent level, should be playoffs. And it certainly shouldn't be losing this bad to Michigan at home. And that's a problem for me. It's a problem for the Alabama coaching staff too. Like Nick Saban said tonight, one of our, targets for the year is 10 wins and another target is beating Auburn. Alabama played poor all year, in my opinion, relative to competition. This game was at home, and it was a calendar circled game for Ohio State. And we have yet again a game, and this is we take a lot of heat, Josh, about a comparison we made about talent, not overall where they'd be drafted or whatever, who's better, but talent when we compared Spencer Rattler like 2 years ago to CJ Stroud. Stroud disappears for stretches in big games. He made some great throws today, but he also threw it to the other team, and he also had 7-point-something yards per attempt. Some of it's scheme, some of it's playing, but Josh, is it fair, given what the standards should be at Ohio State, to say that Ryan Day's on the hot seat?
The difficulty in evaluating Ohio State right now as a team and as a program is that I think there's a disconnect from the recruiting results, the talent on the field, and the production that's being made out of it. The offense, I think, was built years ago on the RPO with Fields, and even before with Barrett a little bit. They were really exploiting the reality of college football, where if you had high-end receiver talent, you could run the RPO, take intermediate and vertical shots, and really blow a team open. What we've seen the last 2 years is that those kinds of offenses have slowed down considerably against high-level competition. I'm not saying you can't be explosive. Alabama did it to Georgia in the SEC title game. We've seen it in spurts from Ohio State this year, but it seems like you can't consistently move the ball and score 40 plus every week against elite teams. And when I mean every week, I mean those kinds of offenses were scoring 40 every week, and you had to have the talent to keep up or you had no shot. And what I think the problem is that right now Ohio State's kind of caught in transition. Again, much the same way you could say Alabama is with what they're trying to do and changes they're trying to make, and they're not quite sure how to find that same level of production or something close to it. I think Stroud's actually played extremely well, even in this loss where he was 7.3 yards per attempt, which is not a good number. Yeah, he had 349 yards passing. He did it on 48 attempts, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks. Didn't have a great QBR. I actually thought he played extremely well. He was dropping the ball in tight windows. You know, I put a tweet out, which people didn't expect people to fully understand, to say, you know, a CJ Stroud window was 1/10 the size of a Bryce Young window. That was before Bryce Young woke up for the first time in 2 months against Auburn. But even still, Stroud is constantly dropping the ball in tight windows and guys that have a DB right on their back, and he's putting the ball right here in front of them. And people talk about the receivers being better or worse. I don't think they understand that the guys aren't actually that open. And they make catches, but they make catches because of the ball placement and the timing that Stroud does it. But he has to do it constantly. He is constantly being asked to throw the ball high and away from a DB, low and away from a DB. And there's not a lot of opportunity for run after catch. And I feel like there's too much talent for that to be the case. There's too much talent for Marvin Harrison Jr. to get he had 7 receptions for 120 yards, 1 touchdown in a game where you throw it. That sounds like a lot, but in a game where you threw it 48 times, I mean, I would have liked to see Harrison get, 15 receptions. I mean, the ball's getting spread out a ton, like a ton. Stover, quite frankly, I don't know that Stover is at the same level as some of the other receivers, but he was targeted a lot in this football game. And so a lot of that has to fall on Day. And I think the biggest problem is that you have a standard of performance for each player. And you always understand when you're looking at your football team, the talent you have versus the production you get, offensive or defensive. And the problem for a number of elite teams this year, Ohio State's one, again, Alabama's been another one, is these teams are stacked. Ohio State's got talent, even without Jackson Smith and Jigba. Everybody was talking about preseason. It's one of the best receiving corps in years. You've got a top 5 draft pick at quarterback, Heisman Hovell. You've got multiple high-level running backs. You've got a good offensive line. And then defensively, you're stacked with talent. You've got like a number 1 overall player on the edge. You've got another 5-star on the other side of the edge. There's talent everywhere across the field. There's no excuse for this talent not to be producing more. And some of it is developmental. Some of it is play calling. Now, people complain about play calling. I think the play calling hasn't been great. I think there's it's very hard without an all-22 to understand how much is the play call, how much is the execution. Is Stroud making the right reads? Is he throwing to a cover guy when he should come off? And I think sometimes, again, that small window thing is good and bad. I think there's times Stroud tries to take a throw that's a very tough throw, and he probably could roll off to another read and have an easier throw.
He's also allergic to running.
Yeah, he is. There were times in that game with man coverage where he had acres to run, and if you do that, it also opens up a lot in the passing game. But I will say, I think the biggest concerns really are more developmental. It's why is this talent not tackling? Why is this talent not blowing guys off the ball? Like, it feels like they're not progressing. Michigan is not nearly as talented a football team. There just won't be as many NFL draft picks, but they're probably a better football team, right? And that speaks to Harbaugh's ability to develop the talent he has, to make a consistent offense out of it. They don't have great quarterback play. I know they threw for a lot of yards, but they did it to open guys. I mean, there was absolutely no indication in this game that J.J. McCarthy was going to throw into tight windows and just zip balls in to beat Ohio State, but they didn't need to. They're out there starting running back. Their backup running back's got a cast on his right hand, and they were still able to produce. And so, yeah, I think that is a negative against Day. I think it's something that's taken years to take hold. But whatever the culture or identity of the program, it slipped a little bit. I don't personally think he's on the hot seat. I don't think he's somebody that should be fired next year, certainly, after an 11-1 season. But I think there has to be some soul searching about who you want your identity to be as Ohio State, how you want to develop your program, what do you want to look like? Because right now I don't think they're where they need to be.
Yeah, and when I say is he on the hot seat, I'm not saying fire him right now. And there's a lot of people in the comments that are saying I'm crazy. But like, if he has another year like this, it's like at some point not being able to make some noise in the playoffs. Yes, I know in 2020 he beat Clemson, but not even being able to consistently make some noise in the playoffs is going to affect recruiting. And then if you can't do it as the most talented or second most talented team in the country, you're not going to do it when recruiting inertia starts to slow down. So he needs to capture it now, and that is a very delicate thing that needs to be considered. And look, next year schedule may not be as easy, and you got to travel to Ann Arbor. And so if he has another one of these years, I think that there's potential to justifiably say he's on the hot seat, even if he does go another 11-1. Because here's the other thing, because of the tie-in with the Pac-12, especially this year if USC gets in the playoffs, because of the tie-in with the Pac-12, Ohio State can lose to Michigan and not get exposed against the second best SEC team or the second best Big 12 team. They're going to play a Utah or an Oregon or somebody like that in the Rose Bowl. And we don't ever get to see whether or not Ohio State is great. It's almost not fair because they don't get to have great wins either because the Big Ten is down. And it's not really their fault. All right, we got to move on, Josh. Someone in the super chat says, give the Gamecocks their long overdue credit. I'm here to do it. I tell everybody all the time. My wife went to South Carolina undergrad, and she was so nervous today. She didn't even see the fumble on the punt. She couldn't watch it. She was watching like the Gamecast updates. This game is crazy to me because there's an outside chance still that Alabama makes the playoffs. And if they do, it's going to be because South Carolina beat Tennessee and Clemson in consecutive weeks, which is kind of funny. But this is interesting to me because Kentucky beat Louisville today. Florida almost beat Florida State. So you got a 6-6 SEC team and a 9-3 team. And then South Carolina, who has worked in the SEC for most of the year, goes out and beats a 10-1 Clemson team. We catch a lot of heat for being SEC homers, and people say SEC is top heavy with Alabama and Georgia, and then it's everybody else. Well, I don't think that's fair when you see data points like this where a South Carolina who had 4 losses in the SEC is going to go out and beat a 10-1. So they're like lower middle of the pack in the SEC is beating potential Power 5 conference champions. So it does give me a little bit of a different view on maybe the SEC schedule. I will say I don't think the SEC is that great this year compared to other years. But what we always say is compared to the year that you're in. But anyway, Josh, is it time at Clemson to move on from DJU? I think he had a 28% completion percentage today. Tell me what you think.
Well, I think I think that's the question. I think the answer is probably. Now we'll say we've seen Klubenik some this season, and he did not play great as a true freshman. I think offensively, their scheme isn't good. They had issues last year with Elliott as offensive coordinator, and then they promoted from within, and I don't think they got any better. So I'm not sure how many of the issues really are on DJU, how many of them are on scheme. I don't think DJU is a good quarterback. He's too inconsistent. And when I say inconsistent, I mean really just throwing mechanics. The guy can make any throw on the field. And like when they played Notre Dame, when he came in relief for Trevor Lawrence as a freshman, I think what you saw is the fact that he couldn't make any throw. And when he was able to kind of roll out and throw on the run to receivers that were running free downfield and could win jump balls, yeah, he's great. When you need him to make tight throws and press coverage, not so much. And he's prone to miss easy throws, missed completions. And we've talked about this in a lot of games. Missed completions are brutal to an offense. Offensive efficiency requires a high completion percentage because it doesn't matter if you throw for 10 yards per attempt. If you run the ball on first down and you throw 2 incompletions, you punt. And you can throw for 14 yards, throw for 15 yards, throw an incompletion, run for 4, throw an incompletion, and you punt. It doesn't matter what your yard per attempt average is if your completion percentage is low. And when it's low because you're missing throws, you don't have a chance to get it higher. And that's DJU's problem pretty consistently. So, yeah, I think there's probably a need to move on, but I'm not sure they really have that much of a better option. I think scheme-wise, they've got to get better. And the big concern I have is in terms of skill position talent, I don't know how much is really waiting in the wings. And in terms of defensive talent, they got a lot of guys leaving. next year. So Clemson's window for where they would be ultra competitive with, and they're ranking in recruiting classes that are very good, but they've been, I want to say, like top 5 to top 10, like 5 to 10th every year. That window may be closing a little bit because there's a lot of teams that exist in that world, and you normally aren't nearly as dominant as Clemson has been. And they've been that way because they've had number one at their position guys in important positions like quarterback with Trevor Lawrence. They've had a couple guys like ETN, which I still believe to this day, and I was very vocal at the time, ETN was more important to that offense than Lawrence was at the time. No one could really deal with him as a runner. And there were so many games they won on ETN's back where Lawrence would just kind of have an off game. Without those guys panning out, they don't have the depth in their classes consistently to be a dominant program. They aren't stacked with 4-star after 4-star or 5-star after 5-star at every position. They've got a handful of 5-stars, and they've got some low 4-star, high 3-star guys that they kind of develop up and form the core of a team around to showcase those other guys. When those guys don't develop to the level they need, they don't really have a plan B that makes them an elite team. And so, yeah, there's a lot of problems at Clemson. And you got to give a lot of credit to South Carolina for what they've done back-to-back weeks. I kind of wondered about this game a lot after they beat Tennessee because they played at a very high level. You can see the talent that Spencer Rattler has. When he's on, he is as good as anyone in the country. I think he's going to get drafted a lot higher because of the last 2 weeks, frankly, because an NFL team's going to take a shot on him. But yeah, feels like a little bit of a changing of the guard. Frankly, it feels like maybe the end of an era. Maybe it won't be. Maybe Dabo rallies the troops, but it just doesn't seem like that train's going to keep going.
Killtack9 says, congrats, Michigan, solidly the number 2 best team. I really wish y'all talked more about how bad tackles have been in our Alabama defensive video. Should USC be in the playoffs with how bad the conference is? That's a big there's a lot of things covered there. But so I'll take the USC one quickly. If USC wins out, they absolutely should. In a year where the parity is there and teams are playing like crap. I know Georgia pulled away today, but they're like solidly number 1, and it was 10-7 at the half versus Georgia Tech. If Georgia Tech had any kind of offense, Georgia would be down, like 21-7 at the half. And I think that Stetson Bennett had 2.9 yards per attempt in the first half this week. As far as Alabama, Josh, today was weird in that Iron Bowl in that, this is where we come back to, and I want to do a quick thing on Alabama because it'll lead into a playoff conversation. But Josh, we've heard Nick Saban talk about like praising Alabama for getting close wins, talking about how hard they practiced in their close losses, but it's almost like we're comparing, like we look at Alabama's 10-2 record and say, oh, that's a nice record. Like if Arkansas went 10-2, that'd be great this year. But like, it's weird that like Pete Golding is someone that I feel like has been protected a little bit from Nick Saban, and they only gave up 24 or 27 or whatever it was. And I say only, they should have given up 7. Robbie Ashford is not a good passing quarterback, below 50% completion, more interceptions than touchdowns. And so the guy can't throw, and you're running, this 2-4-5 and just getting shredded. Auburn had a season high rushing against Alabama. So yeah, it's great for Alabama that they scored 49 points or whatever, but the tackling, as Killtech9 says, wasn't there. And it seems like this team, one, they can't put it together on both sides of the ball in the same game. And 2, to me, all the issues feel like coaching to me. And even if they have a good, clean record, Nick Saban's got to make some changes in the offseason.
That was an interesting game. I mean, you flip on CBS, and between hearing about every call that was made, positive, negative, or critically from Gary Danielson, it was kind of interesting to watch the game plans that both teams are rolling out. In particular, I felt like the game plan defensively for both teams was horrid. We've talked a lot about how Alabama's struggled under Bryce Young when you bring a lot of interior pressure. We have this working theory that the guy is quite short. I think he may be, I'm guessing in the combine, my personal guess, he's going to be about 5'9.5". That's where I think he's going to be, like Doug Flutie level height. It's going to be a major talking point if I'm right on that. but teams have brought this heavy interior blitz, and if you crowd the line of scrimmage, I don't think he can see over because he doesn't throw the ball very well. He doesn't hit counters, et cetera, et cetera. Auburn did not blitz. It's the first team in a long time that I've seen that's been happy to bring 3 or 4. And the commentators, I know a couple times mentioned it when I was watching, that they're just sitting there bringing 3 guys or 4 guys, and it means that everybody's kind of spread out the line of scrimmage he could see, and he just was like a completely different player. And then on the other side of the ball, Alabama defensively, you say 2-4-5, but they spent a lot of that game actually with 3 D linemen on the field. And it's the same thing that had happened in the Ole Miss game. We talked about it then. So I kind of picked up on it pretty quickly. They'd have the the outside linebacker on one side, which is usually Will Anderson. They'd have 3 D linemen, and they always would run a stretch play to the other side away from the edge, away from Will Anderson. Anderson's stats are kind of crummy, but it's because they just ran it away from him almost every play. And you can tell Alabama's defensive linemen are used to playing this weird thing with 2 D linemen, D and D tackle types, and 2 outside linebackers setting the edge, because those true D linemen could not set the edge to save their life. And just like Ole Miss gashed the crap out of Alabama running the ball, doing the same thing, Auburn did it. And Alabama struggled to adjust the whole game. At one point, they went to a 5-man front with 3 D linemen, 2 outside linebackers. Seemed like they slowed down Auburn when they did that, and that's when the game was kind of close. But really, it's like they didn't really have any defensive identity. They didn't quite ever know how to set the edge. And it's just, you just kind of like throw your hands up watching them. And to your point, it feels like they can only play good on either side of the ball. But I think it's because when the defense is playing poorly, the offense actually gets aggressive. And when the offense is playing poorly, the defense actually gets aggressive. But they kind of, they play bend but don't break if the offense is doing poorly, or bend but don't break, I should say, if the offense is doing well, because they feel like they have luxury of it, and vice versa. When the defense is locking people down, they tend to be really short, really conservative. It's kind of bizarre. But that game, to me, watching it was kind of maddening. You can tell Alabama does not have the D linemen they're used to. There's a reason they probably were running that 2-4-5 kind of stuff. Our edges are a lot better than the interior players. But yeah, schematically, watching those 2 teams playing against each other, kind of a masterclass in my opinion, and bad defensive coordinator play. That's about all I want to say on that game. But I think it was worth saying because I was scratching my head the whole game. That was a very poorly coached game from a defensive perspective on both sides of the ball. People focus on Alabama because they're Alabama, but I thought Auburn's coaching staff, frankly, was even worse with their game plan, which was kind of let Bryce Young have time in the pocket and throw downfield. That's not a plan that's worked for anyone for 2 years, but for some reason Auburn thought that was a good idea, even despite having really good pass rushers.
There's a lot of commentary in the comments about Ohio State versus Alabama, who will be ranked ahead of whom. And somebody pointed out that LSU had a bad loss to Tennessee and was still ranked ahead of Alabama.
That was a super chat, so I'll say it was Barkawinabali said LSU, and I apologize if I butchered that, but LSU was in front of Bama with a worse loss, 40-13 at home, to 10-2 Tennessee team, plus a loss to average FSU team. So Ohio State should be number 5 at worst behind USC. That was the super chat.
And Ohio State, in my opinion, should not be. LSU lost big to Tennessee in a game where that day they lost 40% of their offensive line. And that's a little bit different situation. And they lost a game very early to Florida State. New coach, new quarterback, they had like 23 scholarship players, something like that, to start the season. That number's floating around. To me, if you look at Alabama's body of work, their schedule has been significantly tougher than Ohio State's, significantly, especially if you look at home road splits. And Ohio State got dominated at home in a 2-game schedule. They lost 50% of their games. They got dominated at home in the game that was their circle calendar game. It wasn't like it was sandwiched in the middle on the road in the middle of a bunch of other really hard games. Ohio State didn't play a tough schedule, and this was their season. And the first team they played that was actually really good. I know Penn State's going to be a top 10 team this year, and they get credit for that win, but that's one game. Like I said, 2-game season. And they didn't look competitive for 2 quarters. And to me, I have a hard time putting them ahead of Alabama, who has 2 losses on the last play of the game. As much as Alabama's flawed, and I don't want Alabama in the playoffs this year, I think that Bama fatigue is going to have people not wanting Bama in the playoffs because they're Bama. I'm saying I think that you can't just look at Bama and say, oh, they lost 2 games. You must look at everybody else's resume and then say, okay, let me compare resumes. Not Alabama lost 2 games and so from 2016 didn't get in, Penn State with 2 losses, blah, blah, blah. You can't compare across years, and you can't compare Alabama to themselves. You can't say Alabama's not nearly as good as they were 5 years ago, or not. The SEC is not nearly as good. That's not fair, because if you want to talk about conferences, the ACC is terrible. I don't know what the Big 12 is, but I know in the Big 10, there's no like good Wisconsin. There's no good even Purdue or Iowa. So when you have such a small sliver of a season that matters and you get dominated at home, they didn't lose close. I have a hard time keeping them ahead of Alabama. I would have Alabama 1 spot ahead of them, but I still don't want them in the playoffs.
Yeah, it's tough. I'm sitting here trying to figure out in my own head how to deal with it. I'll look at it from the committee's perspective, and I think maybe something to be interesting next week. I'll throw it out there in after the conference championship games. We might actually just do our top 6 for the playoff of what we think it should be and what we think the playoff committee will pick, because I think those 2 things are probably kind of different. I'm not sure how the playoff committee is going to go, and a lot of it really depends on how you view the Big Ten. And if you look at the comment section, and you can see everybody's responses one way or the other, it's pretty simple. If you're a Big Ten fan, you think it's Ohio State, no duh, because they have 1 loss and Alabama has 2. If you're an SEC fan, you think, well, it ought to be Alabama because their schedule's so much harder. And it really comes down to, do you actually think Alabama's schedule's harder? People can talk about LSU being punked by Texas A&M, I think rightly, in the last game of the season. They get beat by Florida State in the opener, and they lose. They got destroyed by Tennessee, though, as you said, that was a weird game because of an injury situation at LSU. I say weird. I mean, they kind of were in a catastrophic injury situation in the offensive line, and they just collapsed. Honestly, we've always said when you talk wins and losses, I care more about the quality of the team you play, not the record, right? Because it doesn't really matter what their record is. That doesn't make them easy or hard to beat. What matters is, are they a good team or not? Like playing Texas is a great example. I think Texas is a pretty high-quality team. Texas isn't going to finish with as good a record as Notre Dame, but I think Texas was a much more difficult game than Notre Dame was. And I'm not sure everybody's going to have that same perspective. I think sitting here today, I think I would put Ohio State ahead of Alabama. I think a lot of people here are saying, as a neutral fan, Ohio State is better than Alabama. Alabama has no bet. One, if you say Alabama has no reason to be in the top 5, you're kidding yourself, because you're not really watching what else is out there. Frankly, it's not about Alabama. It's about normal season. They don't sniff the playoff whatsoever. This is a weak field. But I don't know that I buy that Ohio State's that much better. After seeing them play Michigan, they'd struggle with a lot of stuff Alabama has. And Alabama's been a weird team too. The other thing we don't talk about, right? Bryce Young played Tennessee without having practiced and having played in weeks. Does Alabama beat Tennessee if Bryce Young had practiced? Because they got in a 21-10 hole early. And how much do you want to give Alabama credit for the fact that they had a quarterback injury situation that really cost them all their continuity and maybe caused them to have one of their 2 losses in a game where, they kick a field goal at the end of the game? Alabama just needed a couple breaks in that game, or a couple better plays from the quarterback position to win. So there's so many variables at play. It's hard to say. I do think if you think it's obvious that it's one way or the other, I think that's maybe where maybe would you agree with that? Daniel, you're unrealistic. I think if you think this is obvious that, 2 losses, it has to be worse than 1 loss. No, you're not being real about the fact that scheduling is different in college football. 1 loss in the G5 is not the same as 2 losses in a Power 5. And, you can at least can view the SEC and the Big Ten is different. But it's certainly a hard question, at least in terms of rankings. If you want to say top 10 teams when they played, Alabama's schedule was tremendously harder than Ohio State's. So it's a tough question. It is a very, very tough question. Neither team's going to be a conference champion, so you throw that out. And it's just a matter of what matters more: win-loss record, strength of schedule. How do you view the Big Ten? How do you view the SEC? It's hard, and I'll be very curious to see how the committee tries to resolve all these questions.
Yeah, it's tough. I do have a top 10 though. If you're ready to do a top 10, good luck with yours.
Let me. We can do a top 10. I'd like to. Can I hit some of these super chats? Because we have 7, and I'm probably going to run through them, guys. I apologize, but we're low on time. Stephen Light, who's always been a huge supporter of the channel, said one thing is for sure: Ohio State will not be as patient as Michigan was with Harbaugh. More chaos at Ohio State or Michigan is good for Penn State, which is fine for me, but I'd wait if I was Ohio State. And yeah, I agree. I don't think they'll be as patient, but I also think they're going to be pretty patient at the moment. Paul Dodd, Sean Clifford are blowing coverage for 60 minutes at home to a mid-passing offense.
Cranberry sauce.
Cranberry sauce. Is that your answer? I think it may be blowing coverage for a lot of people. Ace Man, how about them Texas Aggies? I'm sad to say I called this upset a week ago, but I feel this win will go a long way in keeping our team together. Funny to say sad to see. I think people were kind of hoping Jimbo would go. But I think people forgot that A&M was a very talented team. And again, if you have a very talented team that's playing poorly, that does not mean they're going to always play poorly. And people are always – those are the most dangerous teams because sometimes they'll wake up and they'll play to their talent level and everyone's shocked. But it's because the talent was there all along. And I will say I think a lot of people viewed A&M as being really, really, really bad because they lost that 13-10 game to Auburn. But that was a game where A&M was missing A-Chain. They were missing 2 or 3 top receivers. They were missing the three top quarterbacks. I don't think A&M, in fact, I'd be pretty confident Texas A&M beats Auburn if they had Moose Muhammad and if they had A-Chain. That they would have beaten Auburn that game. I think this would be viewed a lot differently. Dawson Malecki said Georgia has a turnover problem and USC defense oozes turnovers. Does that matter? Makes me nervous as a Georgia fan, but I think Georgia has another gear. I take that a little back, and I will say we'll probably talk about this in our top 10s. People are going to view USC based off this Notre Dame game, and that's a mistake. Notre Dame is not a great team. They caught a lot of breaks against Clemson. Clemson is not a great team. South Carolina is not a great team and beat Clemson. I think there's a lot of moving pieces there, and the Heisman hype for Caleb Williams after beating what I think is a pretty darn average Notre Dame team that would probably be like a 6-7 win team in the SEC or Big Ten, either one. Just being honest, I think that's really going to skew a lot of people's opinions because everything in college football is about competition level more than anything. Kendall Hurley said DJU to UCLA and Drake May to Alabama in the offseason. I think both players need a change of scenery. I've seen a lot of rumor about Drake May to Alabama. I know based off what I read that he almost went to Alabama. I think he was a legacy at UNC. That's an interesting one to keep an eye on. I will say DJU is a poor fit schematically for what Chip Kelly wants to do, so I don't think that's going to happen. But I think you may see him go somewhere else if Klubnik wins a job in the spring. Casey Knox, no idea what Ohio State was doing in the second half. Shake my head. I don't either, so I'll just leave it at that. And Nick said, how embarrassed are you guys about your picks against Michigan? There was no world that you thought Blue would blow out Ohio State. And if you're just jumping on now, when we get done, go back and watch the video. We did a very long, dedicated segment on the Michigan-Ohio State game. I know a lot of you guys are watching. And I'll say, before we turn it over to the top 10, with 830 people watching, guys, this has got to be a record for us. Like and subscribe if you haven't. And I know most of you probably have, but please do that. It helps our channel out. Share us wherever you can. You know, we don't ask for a lot from you guys, but that's a big thing to support it. So with that, you've got a lot of time to think, Daniel. I'll let you do your top 10 while I try and finalize my own in spite of the mess that's in front of us right now.
Yeah, good luck with yours. Mine was pretty tough. A lot of people were saying, what's Alabama's best win? And look, I don't know that they don't have a win better than Penn State, but I will say Penn State, what is Penn State's best win to be in the top 10? Because they lost to Ohio State and Michigan and the rest of their – I mean, Penn State has been living off that Auburn win all year, and they were in my top 10. Segue alert. But puff in your chest about Penn State. I'm not sure that Penn State is that much better than a lot of teams that Alabama played. I just think they are also a victim or a beneficiary of a pretty easy schedule. Though I do think they're decent. Georgia number 1, Michigan number 2. I kind of actually struggled with this because Michigan's win today was impressive. I'm starting to second guess how much love I have for Ohio State, and that's a little bit of a problem. Sorry, guys. I tried to mute and it didn't work. But right now, I think that Georgia's dominant win over Oregon, plus their dominant win over Tennessee, is enough to have me up there. But if those two teams played tomorrow, I don't know. I really don't know. I've got TCU number 3. They were absolutely dominant today, and they're getting into this stratosphere where we can talk about them in a way that we haven't all season. Because all season we've been like Big 12 is trash, and TCU's barely winning these games. They really won comfortably today. And I know they struggled last week against Baylor. I don't think Baylor's as bad as their record. And at this point, having TCU 3 and USC 4 tells me just how much parity there is this year, because I think both of those teams would probably be an underdog to my number 5, which is Alabama, and probably be an underdog to number 6, Ohio State. It's very interesting to me because that's where we get into both our rankings and the playoff selection committee decisions. It's a combination of quality and resume. It's a combination of what you've done in eye test and who you can be. And this is why I like the 14 playoff, because I want to see Alabama have to be punished for those 2 losses in a way that keeps them out of the playoffs. Because if Alabama is able to get healthy and prepare for a month and they're number 4, they're probably a better team than USC or TCU in the same scenario. But USC and TCU, in my mind, have earned it more, and that's why I have them ahead of Alabama. Ohio State number 6, the loss today is just tough for me. Like I think if you mentally roll things up to just wins and losses and just ranked opponents or whatever, then you can easily brush off the fact that Ohio State now in 2 seasons has played like 4 good opponents, and they've lost 3 of those games. I mean, last year they lost to Oregon, who wasn't even that good, and got dominated by Michigan. And this year, 2-game season, they went 1-1. It's a little bit troubling to me, but I think they have all the pieces that if you put them on a neutral field and gave them time to prep, they could win some ball games. Sorry, guys. Penn State number 7. I do think they are a good but very flawed team. I think that Penn State, Alabama, Ohio State, the rest of these teams, they could all beat one another. That's how close these are. Tennessee number 8. They handled their business today, but it was Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's excitement over winning some SEC games or beating Florida kind of trailed off and is a distant memory now. Kansas State at number 9. This is a team that, let me make sure, won tonight. They were winning earlier, but it was when we started, and I got mixed up once with Kansas State already. But this is a team that I think could potentially beat TCU. I think they're slated to play TCU in the championship next week. And then assuming they win, which they may not, I've got Washington at number 10. Washington is currently leading Washington State. This is why it's tricky that we do these when we do them. But I don't know where you go. Like, I guess you can put Utah there. But like Clemson lost today, LSU lost today. Are we going to put LSU in the top 10? I don't know. The way they look today, I don't think so. So that's it for me. Josh, give me yours.
Yeah, tough. I now see why you said good luck as I tried to walk through it. My number 1 is Georgia. I maintain that. It's tough between them and Michigan, but And Michigan fans are going to point to their blowout of Ohio State. Georgia still has their blowout of Oregon to start the year. They've had a couple close-ish games, but they've been very consistent. They've been good on defense. They've been very good on offense. They're a really good football team at a level that I don't think anybody else has quite managed to maintain. So I've got Georgia number 1, but I do have Michigan obviously number 2. And you can make an argument for either team, and it comes down to schedule and a lot of other things. Georgia's schedule is not particularly hard either, but frankly, playing a Power 5 out of conference matters to me, and dominating them matters a lot. I think you have to reward that between the two. TCU is my number 3. They've got to sit there until they lose. They've just got to. I'm still not sold that TCU is a great team. I know they destroyed Iowa State. Iowa State has off and on played horrible football throughout the season. They played decently good at times, but they've looked really, really bad at others. So I don't know. I think they may skate into the playoff depending on the Big 12 championship goes. If they lose in the Big 12 championship, I think that's gonna have to be given a lot of weight. My number 4 is Ohio State. I have them ahead of my number 5, Alabama. Right now, it's tough. I mean, it's just tough. Alabama did play a tougher schedule. You've got to really show something to me for a 1-loss team to be better, or a 2-loss team to be ahead of a 1-loss team. I don't know that Alabama's schedule is clearly that much better. I don't know what Alabama's best win is. Now, you can say that about both teams, right? What is the best win for Ohio State? It's probably Penn State. What's their second best win? What's their third best win? That's a hard conversation. Alabama's best win, I'm guessing Ole Miss is where it's at. But when you start talking wins 2 through 5, I think Alabama has a significant edge. People are going to kind of laugh about it, but teams like Mississippi State and Texas are probably better teams on the whole than most of the teams that Ohio State played. So it's a tough conversation. But the truth is, Ohio State lost once. Alabama lost twice. If Alabama had lost once, they would have been 100% would be ahead of Ohio State due to strength of schedule and everything else. If they'd beaten Tennessee at the end of the game, if they'd beaten LSU. Weirdly, this gets into a weird issue, though, that if they'd beaten LSU, they're in the SEC title game, and they might be worse off for that with a second loss. I don't know. That's a discussion for another day. I think this conversation is a very difficult one to have and to figure out. If you notice, my number 6 is USC, and there's probably people balking at that, but let's make the point. If you want to compare Ohio State and USC, Ohio State had a tougher schedule. Yeah, they have a blowout loss, but they have a much tougher schedule. They have better wins than USC. USC's loss to Utah is not a good loss. It may not have been a blowout, but it was a worse team. And USC has really not looked good off and on. And I think there are a couple examples of this where teams, I think, in the pack are getting a little bit too much of a pass. Because they've lost earlier in the year and they're being on a run. There's another team at the end I'll touch on that's in the same boat. So they're at my number 6. My number 7 is Penn State, sitting there with 2 losses. This is where I will say it starts getting really hard. But I think you can't rate Penn State too much lower than this. I don't think somebody was saying in a, Barcano Winabali had a super chat saying Penn State beat Auburn on the road better than Bama beat them at home. It's really not true. I mean, at halftime, the Penn State Auburn game was a close game. Alabama had pulled away by half, and it was really never competitive. They just kind of floated around a 20-point win for a while and struggled to completely put Auburn away. I think Alabama is a considerably better team than Penn State, quite frankly. My number 8 is Tennessee. They destroyed Vanderbilt. They'd fallen down to that range for me last week. They kind of sit there. That South Carolina loss is still not a good loss, even though they beat Clemson. And I'll say Clemson's my number 9. And this is where people are going to start kind of griping, but I challenge you, go look at the top 10 and who's floating around. You want to look at the ones around Clemson? I already had Penn State jump them. Oregon lost, who was right behind Clemson. Tennessee already had ahead of them. LSU just lost. And so now you start looking into a different world, like Kansas State, Washington, Utah. Kansas State has 3 losses. Utah has 3 losses. Notre Dame had 3 losses that just lost again. Florida State has 3 losses, even though they beat Florida. Florida's not a good team. And that was a close game. And so I have LSU 10th because I think the Texas A&M loss is a bad loss. But of the 3 lost teams, you start playing around in the not great 2 lost teams. outside Washington, and I say we're doing this live, so right now they're losing to Washington State. I don't think Washington's a great team, and I don't think their schedule's up to par with what LSU's had to play. I don't know how you put them ahead. And there's another one on here that people want to put higher, and that's Kansas State. Do you guys actually know who Kansas State beat and lost? Because are you aware that Kansas State lost to Tulane 17-10? They've got 3 losses themselves. Say what you want about Texas A&M. Texas A&M loss is still better, in my opinion, than the Tulane loss. And I know Tulane, they're flirting with a ranked team, whatever their record. I don't care. I don't think Tulane's a great team. They're a benefit of being a G5. Kansas State lost by 10 to TCU. They lost by 7 to Texas. There's not a lot about Kansas State that gives me any reason to put them ahead of a 3-loss LSU. And if you want to talk about best win, which is a different conversation, Kansas State's best win, it's probably the blowout over Oklahoma State. Second best would be 7 points over Texas. They don't have the resume that LSU has on that side either. They haven't beaten anyone nearly as good as Alabama. They didn't blow out somebody's, the Oklahoma State blowout, I don't think is as good as blowing out Ole Miss. So, head to head, 3-loss team and a 3-loss team, LSU goes ahead of Kansas State in my view. And that does sort of suggest the teams that are in the top 7-ish, and it's why we're having a hard time ranking 8+. We're in a pretty good gap because a couple of them have lost, and they're still going to stay ahead of the rest right now, in my view, partly due to what some of the other teams did when they lost, and partly otherwise. But yeah, I mean, LSU falls behind Clemson. Clemson loses again and still stays in my top 10 because they're still a 2-loss team and there aren't many options. I think I want to put them ahead of Washington, but it's tough. If you want to argue with my 9 and 10, feel free, but I challenge you to put somebody else in and say it's concretely better, because there are not. We often say there's not a good 7, 8, 9, 10. There are really not a good 9 and 10. If this was a 12-team playoff, you're going to have about 4 or 5 3-loss teams in it by the end of the year when conference championships games play out. It's just everybody's got warts, and most of them have multiple warts at this point.
I did know that Kansas State lost to Tulane. Put them in there anyway. The reason I put them in there is the reason the same thing you talked about, how it's just like everybody around them is just bad. And somebody in the comments said, come on, Utah is way better than LSU. LSU went to Gainesville and comfortably beat Florida. Utah looked great after they lost to a crappy Florida team and went back to the Pac-12, which supports your other point about USC. And I think USC is good. I think they're playing better. I think they actually showed something tonight defensively. Although I will say Drew Pine literally outplayed Caleb Williams. Everybody's talking about Caleb Williams. Pine went off tonight. He had the late interception when they were trying to claw back from a big deficit, but he kind of went off. I think it's interesting that we don't know who the best, 7, 8, 9 teams are, but we also don't know that number 3 is any better than number 10. Like at this point, we don't know. Josh, real quick, as we wind this down, because we've promised that we are only going to do this for an hour on Saturday night, give me your 3 players you're putting on your ballot for the Heisman.
Not one I've given as much thought to as I should. 3 players for the Heisman. Do you have 3? Can you buy me some time by giving your 3?
Yes, I can. I think that if I were voting today, I would put Bijan Robinson, CJ Stroud, and probably Caleb Williams. And I know he hasn't done it against great competition, but the thing is, like, USC's defense is bad. They played better tonight, but they're bad. Going into that UCLA game, having to put up 48 points just to barely win, that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody. So that's probably my 3. And it's funny because some Michigan fan got at me on Twitter because I said that I think Bijan Robinson should be in New York, and it would be a travesty if he's not. And they're like, Corum leads the nation and whatever, or he's the best running back in the country. He's not. Corum will not go. I think he'll probably be the third or fourth running back taken, if that. His size doesn't translate well. I think he's a beneficiary of scheme a little bit. I think Gibbs at Alabama will go ahead of him. I think the kid at TCU, I don't know if he's draft eligible or not, but he's Miller. He's really good. But that's my three. I don't think Bryce Young has played well enough to make it back, and it could be injury related. But there's been games where he just disappeared this year. So that's I wouldn't send him. I hate that this has become a best player on a team that might win the national championship award. And I hate that we're not looking at defensive players, though, players like Will Anderson, he can't give the stats because Pete Golden keeps dropping him back in coverage or stunting him into a guard. But he does have the most pass rushes or quarterback pressures, in the country this year. I've talked enough. Give me your three.
I think after much deliberation, it's anticlimactic, but I think it's the same three you have. The obvious fourth one, and everybody in the comments, as you'd guess, is complaining about Corum. CJ Stroud is the one quarterback I would include. He's statistically, in most respects, he's just the best quarterback in the country, and I'm not sure there's necessarily one particularly close in terms of a passer. Caleb Williams has been a dominant player for USC. This game against Notre Dame, if they didn't have Caleb Williams, if they had an average quarterback, they lose to Notre Dame. Like, he's carrying the team. I don't know that he's been a great passer, but he's functioned very well in the offense, and he's a phenomenal athlete that's just killed people. I think you have to put him there, though I will be honest. I actually think Jaden Daniels has been a better player. He's just played much better competition. I think if you put Jaden Daniels on USC's team and you flip over Caleb Williams, USC is significantly better, and LSU loses a couple more games. But that's a whole other conversation. The Bijan Robinson thing is tough. I mean, Robinson carried Texas, and it's not a knock on Corum, and that's the thing I think people have to understand. When you're talking Heisman, you're comparing against people that have crazy stats, crazy resumes. Williams has a crazy resume. Stroud has a crazy resume, best passing resume of any quarterback by a number of different metrics. But Bijan Robinson, some level, it's how important you are to a team. Bijan Robinson won games by himself to a certain extent. Like the Baylor game, he kind of carried that win when Texas, by all accounts, would have otherwise lost. I think if you put Bijan Robinson on Michigan's team, there would be no question if you flip who they played for. And I agree with you. I think Corum's been really good, but I think he's kind of gotten yards as a function of his role in a very good Michigan team. And he's not been consistently productive down to down. He's gotten huge plays, which have given him a lot of yards, but he hasn't been a bell cow to just constantly get touchdowns and first downs. He's been very effective, don't get me wrong, but Bijan was just kind of an unstoppable force the whole time he's on the field. If you want to make an argument for Corum, I will say Corum's my number 4. But if I had to pick 3, it would be the other 3. It's tight, I think, between and I'll go ahead and say right now, if you made me pick them, I'd probably, if I had to pick the Heisman, I'd probably put Caleb Williams 1, CJ Stroud 2, Bijan Robinson 3, Corum 4, if I had to rank them. But that's where I would be with the top 3.
I gotta throw you a little curveball. One, if Tennessee didn't lose to South Carolina, would you have Hendon Hooker in your top 3?
If Hooker, better way to put it is if Hooker had ended the season better, yeah, probably. Hooker was close to outplaying Stroud this season. The loss to Tennessee or loss to South Carolina was pretty bad. He didn't play great in that game, but it's not just that one. He had a couple games, the Georgia game where he kind of fell flat on his face, and the whole team did, and it was not really just him, but he didn't throw the ball well in that game. And then the South Carolina game was another game where he was off. So it was kind of one more domino, and the Georgia one was excusable. The South Carolina one wasn't so much. That made him feel more like a system quarterback in my view. And the shame of course, is he gets hurt in that game. So we don't really know don't really know what it would have been like if he'd won that game and stayed healthy. But at the point where he's not going to finish the season on top of all that, yeah, unfortunately, he just kind of knocks him off.
A lot of people are killing us for our Corum take. And there was a stat floating around about at this point in the season, here's his numbers next to Derrick Henry's numbers. I want to remind everybody, I think it was 2015 that Derrick Henry won the Heisman. That 2015 Alabama team played the toughest schedule of any team that's ever been in the college football playoffs from 2014 to now. I think they played.
Wasn't it like 7 ranked teams they played? It was
I
something
think they
insane.
played 5 10-win teams that year, and they're. I did the math. They're I think they played 9 bowl opponent or none of their opponents went to bowls, and the average score was like a 37-10 win, something like that. But the other thing is Derrick Henry had 400 yards in his last 2 games, or the next 2 games after where this stat is coming out. But on the flip side, Michigan has played one of the easiest schedules in playoff appearing team history.
I will push back that they've played good defenses. It's been an easy schedule because they've played a lot of
I would
horrid
push
offenses.
back that they've played teams who have high defensive ranks because they haven't played good offenses. That was the whole problem with not knowing. Ohio State was like number 5 in the country in defensive efficiency, but also, and I know that's opponent adjusted, but they hadn't played any offenses that could stress them. So it affects your defensive rankings. I do think that Illinois has a decent defense. I do think that Iowa has a decent defense, but I don't think that I just don't like maybe I'm a little bit influenced by where he's going to go in the NFL draft, but I don't think like if I were picking a running back to start my team, there's probably 5 or 6 I would pick over Corum right now. I would probably pick Edwards on his own team ahead of him. I know that's crazy because he doesn't start over Corum, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of Michigan fans getting angry. Look, if you're whining about someone refusing to say that Blake Corum is better than Derrick Henry, I think you need to sort of take a step back if that's the comparison that's upsetting you. There aren't many backs in the last 15 years that are better than Derrick Henry. I mean, there was the whole McCaffrey debate. Those are the kinds of things that you're wanting to make a comparison to. But this year, you're comparing him to Bijan Robinson, and again, I mean, Bijan Robinson has been incredible. I would argue Bijan Robinson. I mean, the reason that he's in my top 3 is I think he's been the best running back in college football. And it's just the way that he's carried the team, as effective as he's been, is the reason why. It's about how good he is, not about how not good I think Corum is. And that's the same problem when you start ranking top 4 teams, picking those games. People struggle when you get into that sort of error because you want to say, but our guy is really, 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 really good. It's like, yeah, everybody at this level is extremely good. It's not about flaws. It's about, what is otherwise a tremendous resume can become, or a great stat actually can be a flaw just because you're being compared against somebody else who's crazily impressive himself.
Yeah, you're saying that you have him 4th in your Heisman ballot, and people are getting mad. And everybody's saying Iowa's got a great defense, which they've got a good defense this year. Corum ran for 4.6 yards per carry in that game. Not amazing. All right, Josh, it's midnight Eastern. Going to let you close this out with just general thoughts in the day, and we'll wrap it up.
My general thought on today was really something that I said earlier at the beginning of the video, that we talk about wanting chaos in college football, and you've got it. You've got parity. You've seen what parity looks like. And what parity looks like is good teams losing. And it's funny that we all say we want it and we want everybody to be good. But when good teams lose, when your 1 and 2 loss teams lose, everybody's immediate reaction is, oh, they suck. It's funny because in the NFL, you wouldn't say that, right? A team ends up being a 4 or 5 loss team and you can think they're really good because you expect teams to lose. And in college, we just don't. And when you see there being a lot more parity and competition, and I'll say, I don't know who it's going to be. My hedge would be the SEC. But I think we're going to find one of these conferences that's beat itself up the Big Ten, SEC, maybe the Big 12 is a lot better than we're giving them credit for. Just because they beat each other doesn't mean they weren't good. Somebody had to get wins, somebody had to get losses. The SEC in particular has beat itself up really bad because I think they really have a lot of really good teams, but because they've all got losses, everybody wants to say there are a lot of really bad teams. Those two things, it's very hard to distinguish, right? Because somebody's got to lose every week. And if the losses are spread out, that doesn't mean you're bad. It just means everybody's kind of equal. And the other thing I will say is not only everybody likes chaos, but the funny thing is people want this 12-team playoff. And I'll say it again, this week is a lot more boring than a 12-team playoff week. That Alabama game, people are kind of curious to see if they lose to Auburn. If they don't, nobody cares. But a lot of these other ones, like Clemson, they probably are going to be top 12 after they lose. LSU losing to Texas A&M, probably going to stay top 12. So a lot of these games would have just been, just kind of float along. It doesn't really matter. Alabama may well have been able to lose to Auburn and stay a top 12 team with the current landscape of college football. And so, it's going to neuter these games. It's going to neuter these losses. And I think we should take a moment and appreciate the fact that we have a 14 playoff this year, in that it does create a lot more suspense with these discussions. We prefer a 16 playoff, which I think is a lot better for access. And there often are, we've had a number of times that there have been around 5 teams that deserve it. I think this is going to be another year where a 16 playoff probably would be justified, just like it was in 2014, just like it was in 2017. But going from 6 to 12 is a huge jump because you're going to capture about 5 3-loss teams. That would do a tremendous amount for making today a lot less interesting.
Yeah, everybody keeps wanting to add teams to the playoffs under the guise of parity and giving the little guy a shot. The way you spread the accolades around college football is to keep super talented teams like Ohio State and Alabama out of the playoffs by virtue of making them accountable for their regular season. If they're not accountable and then they get 2-3 mulligans and still get in the playoffs, they're going to pull it together. They're going to get healthy. They're going to get schemed right, fix their problems in that month in the offseason, and they're going to win the playoffs. This is the whole thing I said about expanding to 4 is you want to keep the SEC out, but now you've opened it up to get multiple SEC teams in, and then they remove all doubt because they beat other teams in the playoffs to play each other. This has happened twice now. So now we're going to expand it even more, not under the guise of letting Cincinnati win a national championship, but letting them come into the playoffs and just play, only to let an Alabama who would get out blocked from this playoff, and Ohio State that would get blocked from this playoff in a future year. They get 2 mulligans, they still get in, and they're going to end up winning it, and it's a worse product. I think the best way you get more parity, or at least get more, USC has a chance to win this year because they don't have to beat Alabama and Ohio State and Georgia, right? That's how you get one of these non-SEC teams to win, and that's what we want. So that's it for us, y'all. Thanks so much for hanging out with us this late for this long. We'll have some previews coming out this week and probably chop up some videos from this discussion, especially the opener about Michigan and our kind of crow-eating little segment there. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.